this computer. Okay, so official welcome to everyone. And thank you again for what you've done in following us on this journey of looking at OMA, considering Art for the Journey's impact on lots of different populations, on children, adults, veterans, older adults, and for various reasons. We would like to be able to use the brilliance of the evidence-based OMA program and apply it to other populations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Claudia Wright, VCU doctoral researcher. Wave, Claudia, and then you could say hi. And she's here in the office with me, and she's going to make her presentation, and she's going to present her research. It'll take about 30 minutes of your time, and we are going to record this. So thanks again, and take it away, Claudia. See, I think I can mute my
All right. Everyone hear me? Okay. All right. So as Cindy said, my name is Claudia. I'm with VCU and I'm currently working on my doctorate in occupational therapy. And so part of that process is completing a doctoral capstone project. And so I've been working with Art for the Journey, trying to get the Elevating Lives Through Art up on its feet and ready to kind of go out into the community with it. And so first, I'm going to walk through the research that I've kind of done about the effects of social isolation and loneliness in the populations that are affected. And then I'm going to switch gears and go into program design and training when we're thinking about Ella. Um, I want to make sure I can get through the whole PowerPoint. So if you have any questions, save them for the end. I'll be happy to answer them. And if you have to log off at the very end of the slide deck, I put my email just in case you want to reach out to me.
double check everybody can hear you.
Yes. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Perfect. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to jump into research. I'm going to walk you guys through the populations that are most affected, and then we're going to look at the impact of social isolation on overall mental health and physical health, the impact of social isolation on the brain, and then what research currently reports about specific program design components. So currently, young adults aged 15 to 24 are experiencing more social isolation than ever previously reported. However, even with that increase that they're experiencing, older adults are still experiencing social isolation at higher rates than any other age group or population in the US. So the impact of social isolation on overall physical health, a few things while we jump into this. The first is that this type of research is really hard to perform. There's a lot of variables that we can't control for, and so a lot of the research is of low to moderate level of evidence. And what that means is that we can't necessarily say that social isolation and loneliness cause these things, but we can say for a definitive fact that there is a strong link between the two. In addition to that, a lot of the studies that are published currently use social isolation and loneliness as if they're the same thing. And I do just want to make the distinction that social isolation refers to the specific number of social contacts you have, whereas loneliness is referring to that subjective feeling in terms of the number of contact that you have. So loneliness is the feeling, and social isolation is the actual objective case. And so I just want to make that distinction as we run through because some of the studies use them interchangeably, but they are different things to consider. So the first thing is that social isolation is associated with chronic stress, and prolonged stress leads to higher levels of cortisol, which damages tissues over time and it weakens the immune system. Along with that, there have been studies that look at the impact specifically of isolation on the immune system, and they have found that not only do wounds actually heal slower in isolated individuals, but also the body in general has a decreased ability to fight off viruses. The same study that looked at the impact of isolation on the immune system also looked at the impact of isolation on the restorative process of the body, and that is sleep. And so sleep is when the body does most of its healing and when the brain does most of its healing. And what they found is that in isolated individuals, there was an increased risk of sleep apnea, disruptions to the normal sleep cycles, longer wake times after sleep onset, increased daytime dysfunction, and overall poor sleep quality. And all of that greatly impacts the recovery and regeneration process. In addition to this, they have found that social isolation is linked to increased inflammation in the body. And increased inflammation in the body, especially for long periods of time, leads to higher risks of heart disease, stroke, and other chronic conditions. Along the lines of cardiovascular health, both loneliness and isolation have been linked to increased blood pressure, reduced heart function, higher chronic peripheral resistance, which just means that your arteries and veins, it's harder for the body to pump blood through them. Lower cardiac output, which just means your heart is not pumping as much blood as it should be to the body. Elevated morning ACTH levels. When you have high ACTH levels in the morning, that is an indication that you're experiencing chronic stress, and it has to do with cortisol specifically. And then increased mortality rate from cardiovascular disease. Even when all other variables are kind of controlled for, you are still more likely to have mortality as from a cardiovascular episode than somebody who is not isolated.
That's something.
Along the lines of cardiovascular disease, there's also been some research looking specifically at stroke and diabetes, and they have found that long-term isolation is associated with an increased risk of stroke, mainly due to factors such as stress and poor health behaviors and hypertension. And so when we're talking about poor health behaviors, we're talking about how isolated individuals are less likely to maintain proper diet, exercise, medication regimens, even making riskier health choices in terms of drug use and abuse. And so all of that leads to poor disease control in general, but also increased risk of complications with specific diagnoses. In addition to that, isolation also increases your risk of metabolic syndrome, which is just a really fancy term for a cluster of conditions like high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol, high blood sugar, and all of these increase your risk of having cardiovascular disease or stroke. And then lastly, for physical health, endocrine function. So they have found that loneliness increases cortisol, which we talked about as our stress hormone, and adrenaline. So adrenaline is your fight or flight hormone. This leads to higher levels of inflammation, it leads to immune suppression, and it leads to cardiovascular strain. And then along with this, loneliness has also been associated with decreased oxytocin, which is your bonding hormone, and serotonin, which is your feel-good hormone. And decreases in this can contribute to mood disorders such as depression, anxiety, and metabolic disruptions. So for mental health, there's a lot of research about the impact of isolation and loneliness on mental health. However, studies vary greatly in reporting the outcomes of these. The two that remain pretty consistent across the board is depression and anxiety. And so social isolation is linked to an increase in depression, and loneliness is often linked to an increase in social anxiety and a fear of rejection. And so, what's really interesting about anxiety and loneliness is that it creates this really vicious cycle of avoidance. So, somebody is already really fearful of rejection and judgment, and so they avoid social situations, which then increases that feeling of loneliness, which then causes an increase in that fear of rejection and avoidance. And what's really interesting about this cycle is it shows us that those who need programming the most to combat social isolation are going to be less likely to engage in those programs. And so when we're thinking about building programs, you have to think about how do you get these people who are more isolated than others to want to join these types of programs. And then lastly, for overall mental health, I have genetic and endocrine factors. There was a pretty large study done to try and figure out if there is some type of genetic disposition to developing loneliness. And what they found is that there are about 50 genes that make you predisposed to experiencing loneliness and also predisposed to develop other mental health disorders. Which is just super interesting. And those people who have those genes are more likely to experience more intense effects from loneliness as a result. Okay, so now we're going to look at the impact of isolation and loneliness on the brain. So the brain specifically, this is extra hard to study, and so a lot of these studies use a combination of human studies and animal studies. But in general, what the literature reports is that cognitive and structural changes occur as a result of social isolation. And there are three key parts of the brain that tend to come up a lot in the literature. So those three parts are the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the planning, your decision making, and your social behavior. That's kind of your executive function. Everything goes to that prefrontal cortex. Then you have the amygdala, which processes emotions such as fear and anxiety. And in isolated individuals, this becomes hyperactive and that contributes to heightened emotional responses. And then lastly, we have the hippocampus. So this is your memory and learning center. And in isolated animals and humans, this shows a reduction in volume and activity, which impacts your short-term memory and your ability to form new memories. In addition to these structural changes, they've also found that the actual cortex thins in those who are experiencing social isolation. The cortex is the outermost layer of the brain, and it looks very small, but it's where most of your neurons are housed. It's where the gray matter is. And so that is responsible for any and all of your higher order functions. So sensory processing, decision making, emotional regulation. And when this thinning occurs, it makes all of these functions harder for your brain to be able to do. So this just shows where those structures are. So the prefrontal cortex is over here, and then we have the amygdala, which is that emotional processing, and the hippocampus kind of up and behind it, which is your memory. And then the image on the right, this actually shows cerebral atrophy, which is different than cortical thinning. So the cortex is this really dark pink outermost layer, and so that's what they've discovered thins in isolated individuals. Okay, so next with the brain, we have neuroplasticity. Loneliness specifically has been associated with an impaired ability to form new neural connections, and this impacts your memory, your attention, your problem solving, emotional regulation. It also they have found that reduced social engagement and cognitive stimulation make it harder for you to be able to adapt to specific situations and process information. And lastly, for the brain, we have cognitive decline. So prolonged isolation has been linked to accelerated cognitive decline, and it's been linked to developing neurodegenerative diseases. So with the exception of neurodegenerative diseases, what is really compelling about this research is that they have found that after these isolated animals or isolated individuals have been reintroduced to a good, healthy social environment, some of these changes actually are able to reverse. So the brain heals itself when they're reintroduced back to these social situations, which is incredible and really shows the importance of having programs that provide this type of activity for people.
That's great news.
All right, and so program design. So just like with the research on the effects of social isolation, there is not a whole lot of research about specific program design, and the ones that do exist were done by like community partners. And so there's just a lot of things that we can't control for, a lot of confounding variables. But in general, volunteering has been linked to increased well-being, reduced depression, enhanced life satisfaction. And some studies have even found a positive link between volunteering and reduced mortality, but that varies kind of depending on the study you read. So some have a significant effect and some don't report a significant effect. Along with volunteering, intergenerational programs have been shown to promote social engagement, reduce stereotypes, and improve cognitive function. And specifically in the older adult population, intergenerational programs have been linked to reduced anxiety, improved physical activity, and increased life satisfaction. Again, with this one, there's limited strong evidence of the overall benefits and best practices of intergenerational programs, but the literature that does exist reports that there are typically positive outcomes. Person-centered care is a hallmark of OMA and it'll be a hallmark of ELA as well. And it's a really strong framework. So it does a really great job of laying out how like what person-centered care means. With that being said, there's a pretty large variation in how that framework is understood and implemented. And a lot of that just depends on population needs. And so it might look different between facility, but typically any program that's person-centered, it emphasizes the uniqueness of the individual, the partnerships, and the meaningful activities. And then lastly, for art-based interventions and program design. So art interventions specifically have been shown to be pretty effective in reducing loneliness, enhancing cognitive function, and providing a really great platform for emotional expression. Group art-based activities that have been shown to promote connection and reduce isolation. And a program that's structured tends to yield better outcomes than a program that is unstructured. And then along the lines of structure and unstructure, when the quality of the social interactions are the focus point, the benefits outweigh the quantity, so the number of people that that are kind of in the program itself. So focusing on the quality over the quantity of interactions taking place. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and go into program design and training. I have been working with Art for the Journey to help build some of the program design components to help get a pilot program kind of set up and moving so that we can begin really bringing Ella to the community and figuring out what, a best practice program would look like for Ella. So I'm going to move through this section in terms of the roles that you see in OMA because the roles are going to remain the same for Ella. And so that would be the artist, the volunteer, and the facilitator. And so that's how we'll move through what program design would look like and what training would look like with the new program. So the role of the artist doesn't actually change. The artist will always be the artist. Their role is the same across the board. What does change about the artist are the needs of the population. So OMA was designed for that dementia population who has require a lot more one-on-one care to be able to meet the physical needs, the cognitive needs, and the emotional needs in a way that's going to make the program be the most effective. When we're talking about a generalized older adult population, those physical, cognitive, and emotional needs change slightly. And not only do they change slightly just compared to the original population OMA was created for, but they're also going to change between facilities. So one facility's population needs are going to look different from another facility's population needs. And that's why Ella is going to be really, really important. And this is something that's going to really define Ella from OMA in the sense that as these needs change, the hope is that facilitators will have every tool imaginable to be able to make most appropriate program adaptations for those needs. So next is the volunteer. OMA does a really good job at laying out the evidence base and the importance of their program. And all of that happens under the volunteer. So that part of the training when you're going through as a facilitator and that part of the training when you're going through as a volunteer. So when we're thinking about Ella, understanding what Ella's quote unquote cortical lobes is going to be is really important because that's our evidence base. And so that research, the impact of social isolation and loneliness on overall health and well-being, is where Ella is going to outline its unique contributions, its importance, and why and how it's rooted in evidence. And so we have to think about that moving forward with Ella. We also need to consider flexible facilitation techniques as the population changes. So again, OMA does a really great job of laying out how to provide cognitive supports for that population to be able to engage successfully with the projects and engage successfully with their partners. And so the same thing needs to happen with Ella. What's different between Ella and OMA supports is that with Ella, being able to provide a spectrum of support is going to have much more importance because you're going to have two people in the same room who are going to have vastly different physical needs, maybe even vastly different cognitive needs, but we want them both to be successful at the same time. And so being able to provide that spectrum of support is going to be really important. So the volunteer role is what's going to change the most between OMA and Ella. This is where most of the difference is going to be outlined. When we're thinking about Ella, I think the most likely adaptation that's going to take place is group-based facilitation, and that responsibility would fall then on the volunteer. And so what that would look like is a volunteer would be working with 2 or 3 artists, depending on the needs of those artists, and they would be managing the materials for their group. They would be helping to coordinate and facilitate the projects for their group, and they would serve as social facilitators. And this is the really big part to what we expect to see coming from Ella. When I'm talking about social facilitation, the volunteer will be the catalyst for these peer relationships to form. They're the catalyst for the community building, they're the catalyst for providing the person-centered care. And it's a little bit challenging to explain what I mean by social facilitation. So I have a chart that I'm going to go through. So with Ella, you would have, your one volunteer with your 2 to 3 artists. And the volunteer serves as the social facilitator. So volunteer might ask during social time a question to the artist, to the table. How has everyone's week been, or something along those lines? And so volunteer or artist one will answer, my week's been really good. And then artist two will say, yeah, like my week's been pretty good. And maybe artist three says, you know what, like I had a rough week, but I'm hoping this weekend is better. And so what you see here is what you see in OMA, where you have the artist and volunteer relationships forming. What makes Ella unique is that the volunteer is trained not only to build those connections, but to then build these connections happening between the artists, so that eventually the volunteer responsibility takes a little bit of a step back, because these artists are now building these meaningful relationships by themselves. So instead of the volunteer asking, how has your week been? The artists come in and they're asking each other, how has your week been? And they're supporting each other. And what's really special about this, and what really makes Ella stick out using this type of format, is that in 8 weeks, the volunteer is no longer there and the art is no longer there until the next program session occurs. But who is still there are these 3 artists. And so that relationship that they've formed, they can then take elsewhere within their community, within their living situation. And this makes the impact of the program long lasting. It's combating social isolation even after the program ends. And so that's what we really, really want and what we're looking for when we're thinking about Ella. So now we're going to go into the role of the facilitator. As a volunteer takes on more responsibility when we're considering the way that we're outlining this new program, the facilitator's responsibility kind of takes a little bit of a step back during the program sessions, but a step forward, or 3 steps forward, when we're thinking about the preparation that's taking place. And so what that looks like is the facilitators being able to make informed program design choices based on their population needs. Because like we talked about, their population needs might change from session to session. So one session might look a little bit different from the session that they're hosting next, from the program sessions they're hosting next. And so training them to be able to make those informed decisions, and them being able to make those informed decisions. It also means being able to appropriately distribute responsibilities between the volunteers and staff members, and knowing what the volunteer can and can't do, being able to troubleshoot their programs, and going through the adaptation process when thinking about a new program. All of that is going to be 3 steps forward in terms of the facilitator role. In addition to that, it becomes far more important for the facilitator to be really in tune with the volunteer coaching that's taking place. Because we're in a group setting, if something goes wrong, that relationship can deteriorate really fast, and we don't want that. And so they're going to need to be a little bit more in tune with what's happening with the groups, the types of conversations that are happening in the groups, if there's challenging behaviors, and provide that coaching as appropriate to ensure that the group atmosphere remains positive and healthy to be able to maintain those relationships. And then along with that coaching, they're taking a step forward in terms of the partnerships and the group placement. So now it's not just one-to-one anymore. Now you're thinking about, are the artists going to be good fits for each other? Is the volunteer going to be a good fit for those 3 artists or 2 artists? And as a group, is it going to be what we need it to be? Are they going to be able to provide each other with what they need? And so the facilitator does take a step forward in that sense. And then I'm going to bring everything together here when we're considering the program components specifically. When we are looking at the pilot program, the volunteer and facilitator responsibilities will change like we just talked about. But in addition to that, there we have other options in terms of providing art education because our generalized population has more independence, they want to have more autonomy and they have more capacity for that. And so the program needs to be tailored to that. Otherwise, it might feel too restrictive for them and they're not going to feel engaged or interested. And so providing art education can look very different and it'll have to be trialed a few different ways when we're thinking about how we pilot a program. But in general, allowing that education to take place as the interest of the artist allows is a really great opportunity for them to identify with this new role of an artist and to identify with each other. Along those lines as well, with that independence and that increased capacity, functional capacity, we should be providing more choice and increased autonomy. So instead of having two, pre-made palettes of paint offered to the volunteers, we might decide to have some type of swatch available so that they're actually creating their own palette. And that'll also have to be trialed a few different ways in order to make it the most effective, because when we're thinking about art waitressing, it might be that the volunteer does some art waitressing and the facilitator does other parts. And so that's something that we'll have to trial as well with the new program. But thinking about the components we can add in that are going to increase that feeling of autonomy and the choice that our participants have. Again, community engagement. There are a lot of really great components of OMA that allow for community engagement. So if you think about the introduction song and the closing song, that's an opportunity for everybody in the room to interact with one another, to have a shared experience. Same with the art show, that's an opportunity for everybody to have a shared experience. And that's still incredibly important when we're thinking about OMA. So not only do we want those small groups taking place, but we want that larger community atmosphere taking place as well. And so when we're thinking about Ella, we have to think about how do you appropriately provide that community engagement at a level that is functional for this population. So the songs that we're using for OMA probably aren't more very appropriate for this generalized population. And so we have to think about what then do we do to create that community environment when we're developing Ella. And project complexity. Again, the OMA projects are super great for the population that they were built for, that they're intended for. But as we're moving into a more generalized population, these projects might be too easy and not complex enough for them. And again, we want to make sure that they're still enjoying the art making process and that they're still interested in the art making process. And so the complexity of the projects or the projects we're delivering to this population might look a little bit different. And then lastly, when we're thinking about the way in which this program is designed and who we're serving, the setting can be a little bit different. And this program might be more appropriate for community-based settings and allow for more opportunity and growth within the community in general. And so that's something else that we're considering when we're thinking about developing Ella and piloting Ella. So this slide I've included for a couple of reasons. One, this slide shows the types of adaptations that are already being made out in the community under the umbrella of OMA. Some of the adaptations are really good, and they've gone through the process of trial and error, and they figured out what works really well for their populations and what doesn't, and how to get the best outcomes as a result of these program adaptations. And then some of them aren't the best adaptations for their population. They're not actually meeting the population needs in the best way, and so therefore the outcomes of the program aren't the best that they could be. And this is another area where I just feel like Ella is so important because we're providing a platform for those adaptations to take place so that they are appropriate and that they are leading to the best possible program outcomes. Another thing I want to point out is that not only are the other adaptations being made in terms of the design, the components of the program, but also the population. So there are already groups who are taking OMA out to the community, to a more generalized population, and they're doing that in an appropriate way. But there are also programs that are kind of leaving out the population that OMA was originally intended for, and we also don't want that. And so that's another area where Ella can step in and make sure that if you're doing Ella, you also have the obligation that if you have or you are working with a dementia population or a memory care population, that you are offering OMA as well. And so that's super important. And that kind of leads us into training logistics. So when we're thinking about, okay, we've piloted the program, we have a really strong framework, we have a really good group of adaptations that can be easily moved around depending on population needs. How do we train? This is where the relationship between OMA and Ella is super important. So 99% of the time, odds are we're gonna want people to be trained in OMA first. One, because OMA is the core of Ella. Ella looks different, but the core is still OMA. Two, what we don't want, which is starting to happen out in the community already, is for people to only get trained and implement something like Ella and then forget the population that this program was originally intended for, who benefits so, so greatly for it, and who doesn't have a lot of programs to support them. And so with Ella, this allows for those types of requirements to be put in place. So you have to be trained in OMA if you are serving a memory care population before you can be trained in Ella. And if you have both, you need to be offering both programs for the appropriate population. And so once that relationship is really well defined, the programs will uplift each other and overall have better outcomes and benefits to those different populations. And also, once that relationship is defined, you can start to think about how do we train? And so that could be a dual certification where people are getting both OMA and Ella training at the same time, whether that be in person or online. And then you can consider online certification once we've hammered out those requirements. So if you are going to be trained in Ella, you need to have OMA first if you meet these requirements, and vice versa. And then next steps. So I mentioned earlier, I've been working with Art for the Journey throughout my capstone experience to really help design this program. And so currently, Art for the Journey is in step one of next steps. So we're working on designing the pilot framework. We're working on finding locations to test these pilot frameworks at. And we also have started developing outcome measurement tools to help one inform the adaptation process while we are piloting the program. So, figuring out what's working and what doesn't based on the feedback that the artists are giving us and the volunteers are giving us. But two, those outcome tools, measurement tools, can then be used across the board for the program in general once it's launched. And a difference between these measurement tools as well is that not only are we measuring the outcomes of the program on the artists, but we're also looking at the outcome of the program on the volunteers so that we can say that the program benefits both parties engaging. And that really sets Ella apart. And that really makes it easier to acquire funding to get Ella up on its feet. And so um, after stage one, which is kind of what we're in the middle of, then we have to think about, okay, so what's the relationship between OMA and Ella, and how are we going to do these trainings, and what site are we going to have to be able to upload all of this stuff to for the trainings, for the data, for contacts once we start training people, and then funding again. Where are the sustainable funding sources going to come from, and using that data to support the need for the program. And so that is kind of an overview of what I've been working on and the research that helps support that Ella is really, really needed. It is such a beneficial program. And when brought to the community, these two programs together will do a great deal in helping to mitigate the effects of social isolation and loneliness on overall health and just general well being and community health. And that is it.
Bravo. That is fantastic. Thank you for that. Beautiful amount of work and beautiful presentation and beautiful PowerPoint. So you can stop share and we'll go ahead and open up
That
for
was
questions.
wonderful.
Let's see.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claudia. That was really good.
Nice job. I mean, I like the way you thought through the adaptation process. I mean, they're really very thought-provoking and well done.
Very impressive piece of work. The studies in the first part of your presentation that document the effects of various systems. generally, where are those studies published?
At the very end of my PowerPoint decks, I have like 6 slides of studies. A lot of the studies came from Sinhall, PubMed, NIH, the WHO. It's a large, it's about
Large,
40, yeah,
large bibliography?
yes, it's about 40 something resources, all from various different databases. But they're all at the end of the slide decks.
All right. And one could track them, as you said, in PubMed.
PubMed.
Yeah, PubMed, Sinhall. There's a few others, but yeah, about 4 or 5 different databases.
Mhm.
Do you have the links or the summary, the titles of the various research that you looked at that you could put on a page for
Yes.
reference?
Yeah, I have a Google Sheets that has the resources where they were published, dates, authors, and then a write-up of each one with the links attached, the hyperlinks, and I can also send that out.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
The other thing you said you were going to cover were funding opportunities. Did you have much success in identifying specific funding streams?
I didn't go through funding streams, partly because the last presentation, they went through some funding streams, but also I was mainly focused on program design in terms of what is the need? Are we addressing something that is really an issue? Is it really impacting health the way that we think it's impacting health? And then focusing on, okay, it is. So how do we design a program for that? I think the funding streams, as the program gets piloted, I think what'll happen is the data from those pilot programs will help get the funding that is needed to get the program up on its feet. But there's a lot of the funding is all over the place right now. So
Yeah.
Mark, just
We went on mute, Cindy.
You're on mute, Cindy. Something happened. Or we lost you.
hi, can you hear me? I think you have to put yours down when I talk. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just to give you a background here, the first 2 researchers were MBA students from University of Richmond who did the needs assessment. They looked at demographics. They looked at the funding potential side of things, if we could get there. Claudia's research was after becoming a certified OMA facilitator, after sitting and participating as a volunteer at St. Mary's Woods in OMA, after visiting Aging and Engaging, which is one of our trainees who has really adapted the OMA program to low-income older adults, after being physically there and then taking her research to where do we go after knowing that there is definitely need, understanding the science of what's happening in our bodies with social isolation and how cellularly it's affecting our overall health, and then thinking about how, and this is what I liked in this conflation that you mentioned there, the people who are more likely to be depressed or lonely are least likely to seek this opportunity to mitigate their feelings of social isolation. Or as Dr. Frabel once said, maybe it's just saying, I feel lonely, or speaking and admitting maybe that they have a sense of loneliness that they feel somewhat depressed or down about. So here we have a way to provide something not scary. It's art. And because the way OMA was designed to be failure-free, this is really a beautiful way to enter into art. And we know about the many reasons to tap into the arts. And I also like that you touched on neuroplasticity and the hope that once you do take the steps to take an art class and to start to become a part of a community, you can reverse the negative effects of what's happening in your brain and your body. So it's really hopeful information from a more scientific explanation. So business first, should we do this? And funding, how do we get the funding for this? And then second to that, let's dive deeper. And that's what Claudia did. So we really are still in a step-by-step process of trying to get there and trying to say, once we have the data, which Claudia, by the way, has created intake data collection forms, which we can attach to what we send you, which will show you exactly the questions that we would ask in an Ella session and how they differ a little bit from what they would ask in an OMA session. It's somewhat similar, but also different. So we will be looking at that data to hopefully vet this program that reaches beyond people living with dementia. So I'm really appreciative of all that you've done. Are there any other questions? I was thinking about you, Megan. Megan is our representative here from Scripps Gerontology, and a very inside we call them the mothership. OMA is the Scripps Gerontology, the mothership. And I really like the point that Claudia made, that it is so important to be certified in OMA, to understand the wealth and the beauty of this brilliant program before you take the steps to go into Ella, which is an adaptation. And we're trying to be that best practice model because we're trainers. We train in OMA as partners to Scripps, and we want to keep crossing our T's and dotting our I's so it doesn't unravel and provide an opportunity for so many other people.
You addressed every one of the questions that I had in my head about.
I think you're muted.
Oh, hold on.
I think it maybe your sound, Cindy.
I'm open.
Is my volume?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. I really loved how you thought through the different issues that would occur moving from OMA to Ella, and I think having people certified in OMA first is brilliant because it is, and then understanding the principles of OMA and then applying the principles to Ella as well as, adapting it. You wouldn't be able to do that unless you were actually OMA trained.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, I think where people really hit the wall with loneliness is in transitions. Like when you're transitioning from, say, home into an institutional setting, or another kind of transition where you're losing your traditional support system, social support system, or it's being, it's at a distance, and you are without that. And if you're depressed and lonely to start with, it makes it very difficult to kind of adjust to and engage in the new community. And this is a real kind of a transition. I mean, it helps with that kind of transition because you're bringing them into a community of social engagement and all of that. Really well done, guys. I wish we could tell that story to everybody.
Well, the identifying the need, it's much bigger than what we know.
Yeah.
There's so much need. And so I'm hoping that this can reach so many more lives. We've already, through the past 3 years, been able to train and certify people living in nursing home settings. And if you think about that, that is just one population. And Stephanie Shanks made the point today, since we have a new library, Chesterfield libraries are now going to try to place OMA in every single library. That's their
wonderful
goal. Because did you know that an overwhelming majority of individuals living with dementia live at home and have a caregiver at home? So they're not able to tap into the beautiful evidence-based program OMA because they're not living in long-term care. except now some of these newly certified facilitators are out there trying to make a difference that way. And that's what we're just trying to do. We're trying to take that pebble that's dropped in the water, like Lika had said once, the ripple effect, to touch so many more lives.
Yeah, I hope this doesn't sound like it's too off the wall or off point, but I've been working with a grief program as a volunteer, and a couple of people that are going through a lot of grief because they lost a spouse or whatever. We're talking about how they have to force themselves out of their homes and out of the isolation that they feel. And even though in one of the ways they do that is they'll go shopping and they'll ask a friend to go with them. And they have no intention at all of buying anything, but they'll go to, say, Short Pump Mall, and just to go in stores and be around people and that kind of thing. It suddenly occurred to me, of course, a lot of things are occurring to me as I get older, that how many people go to the mall to escape social isolation? And I was saying, if you walk into some of these stores, just say, okay, all you people that are here, not to buy anything, but just to be with other people and maybe, relieve yourself of the isolation you feel. Would you step to this side of the store? And how many of these people how many people in that store are actually there for reasons that have nothing to do with actually buying anything, but just to be around other people? And, if we're looking for settings where Ella could be implemented, I almost wonder if shopping malls would be one of those places.
A community setting.
Yeah.
Where people feel safe and yeah, that's an idea, Mark. I like that. A big, massive OMA/Ella session.
Yeah.
Everyone
Short
there.
Pump Mall, right?
Lots of
They've
art.
got a lot of vacant space around there too.
Have you explored that idea with any mall owners?
No, I just popped that idea here, actually.
It's an interesting idea. I'm just wondering, if how they would respond. Yeah.
I wonder if I'm sorry, Jack, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the guy we were talking to with Tallheimer, when we were thinking about Regency, I wonder if he would be interested in something like this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, the world needs togetherness right now, and using the beautiful OMA failure-free, person-centered art concept and broadening it to many people, that would be pretty extraordinary. Megan, do you have any thoughts on this research? Because we're trying to work with you guys to make sure that that we're trying to steward and do the best possible job of making this adaptation very special and produce those beautiful, positive results that help people.
Yeah, I think this was really helpful, just trying to get a feel for the program designs. I really appreciated that, Claudia. I think that was really clear, and you did a really great job just explaining everything. I did have a question about like who your target would be to get trained with Ella. I know for OMA, it was really nursing homes and like people living with dementia and people that work that way. But do you have a plan for like who you're hoping would be engaging in this program or who would get trained in general? And I don't know, that could be a question for Cindy or Claudia or Stephanie, but I was curious about that.
Well, churches, could be a possibility. As a pastoral, the grief group that I'm participating in helping out with is church related, and they actually have, believe it or not, it's an 8-session program, and one of the sessions is devoted to art, to expressing what's going on with you in terms of visual art. So I'm wondering, if churches that are reaching out to their congregations where you have, people, I mean, there's a subset of people in almost every church who are dealing at some level with grief. and the isolation that goes along with it. Having had the opportunity to hear a lot of people's stories in this program, and I wonder if churches wouldn't be a very welcoming place for this program.
Long-term care is still an opportunity because we're looking at the stages. If you think about it, as you enter, you might be me, Cindy, coming in now. I'm just going to be in a group setting now, and I'm going to enjoy, like you, Jack, just enjoy living and having this access to some services and some entertainment and some things that come along with that. And then over the course of time, maybe something happens with my health, and maybe like my mother, maybe I have a stroke, and maybe I develop Lewy body dementia. And then, so over the continuum of care, it seems to me would be a nice opportunity for Ella, for Oma, so that we don't isolate just one group, so that we reach everyone that might benefit from participating in this. And then the other thought I had was we're already making headway with the libraries because of two recently certified facilitators who want to make a difference for that overwhelming majority of people living with dementia that are living at home. But libraries provide access to everyone. I love the library, and I've been going to the library since I was a kid. And I think that's a beautiful public place. So if we can think this way, we can think a little bit outside of the box of where we've been. And certainly low-income adult, people with great need, housing. So like Jody Winship with Aging and Engaging, she has adapted the OMA program to suit her needs. And we've been watching and observing what she's doing so that we can hopefully provide this information to others. Because what we've been able to do in terms of impacting lives is we're able to do it through certifying and sharing this information with others. And that's how we've been able to impact so many lives, through partnering with Scripps and through training others, and then creating many little centers of where OMA, we brought OMA to an art center in Glen Allen, Cultural Arts Center of Glen Allen. They could use an expansion to other populations too. We just don't want it to be, and I'm hoping that Megan, you agree with this, when you do something where you just allow everything just to kind of naturally be adapted, you possibly lose that very scientific best practice. So we're trying to create that adaptation in a best practice model, much like our mothership would hopefully believe we're doing. That's what we would hope to do.
Well, clearly, older adults, wherever, senior programs, those kinds of things, people who are dealing with medical disabilities that tend to socially isolate them naturally because they can't get out. People who are undergoing challenging medical treatments like cancer treatment and that kind of thing. We have some dear friends who at church, they're a little bit older than I am. He has Parkinson's, and she has been being treated for ovarian cancer in her 80s, and they haven't been to church in a year. And they came to an event the other day, and it was the first time in a year where they had been in a community setting like that. And so there's so many, I think, opportunities to reach these populations who are, by the nature of their life situation, or find themselves socially isolated. And I think it's wonderful. And I actually think it could be made, literally, Ella could be one session of this 8-session grief program.
That's a good start right there.
Yeah.
If you'd like to suggest that. Would anyone else like to ask a question of Claudia? Well, we have her. She's
Yes, I
almost
do. This is Connie.
okay.
Claudia, amazing work. I was particularly interested in the fact that there were so many physical and even genetic aspects of social isolation, something that they don't, I mean, it was very thorough, all the physical effects. I did want to ask you, you had mentioned person-centered care. What are examples of that?
So person-centered care, the focus is on, so for an example, in healthcare, when we are looking at person-centered care, it means that the types of treatment that you're providing, it means that the interactions you're having are based in that person. So they're interested in it. It means something to them. The conversation is meaningful in and of itself. They are the forefront of, they're guiding you. So it is providing care in a way that matches exactly what that person is needing and wanting, but also getting the outcomes that you're looking for. And so person-centered care and healthcare looks a little bit different than if you were doing person-centered care like in a community-based setting. The reason for that being that the needs are different, but you're still really focusing on that person's a unique person. The activity we're doing is meaningful to them, not to me, to them. And the conversation and the interactions we're having are meaningful and important and necessary. And so that's what we're kind of thinking of when we're looking at person-centered care. And so with OMA, person-centered care is that you are focused on your artist. You are helping them, whether that be manual facilitation to help them be able to physically engage with that. You're giving them that creative expression and freedom to make the art the way that they want to make the art. And so in OMA, that's what it means. And so in Ella, it means the same thing. But what we're looking at is not only is the activity meaningful, the session is meaningful, but those relationships are meaningful. Those relationships are going to be long lasting because that volunteer has set them up for that success. So they've already done a lot of that hard work in terms of how do we find a meaningful connection between ourselves, because the volunteer has facilitated it. And so when I'm talking about person-centered care with Ella, that relationship component is super important, as well as the actual art itself being that meaningful activity, the method of delivery for those relationships.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to just update you about where we are. The original plan was to look and seek federal funding through the federal earmark, and that didn't actually go all the way through. It went, two senators said, great, lots of letters of recommendation, and I want to thank everyone that participated in that and provided that. But when it got to the Health and Human Services Committee at the federal level, it was not approved. And that was before now the shutdown for almost all of the
Yeah, that was last year, right?
Right. So funding will be something that we will be working towards. And I know that that's something that OMA continues to work towards, and we continue to work towards for OMA. So for both programs, we will be always looking for ways to fund. And I think the research that you've done, Claudia, and the research we have from the group in the needs assessment and all of that will help us get there. And we probably will start without funding because that's how we do. That's how we started with St. Mary's Woods with OMA, and look what happened. So we will begin to deliver. We actually are doing some of the Ella programming at Marywood, and it's happening somewhat at St. Mary's Woods. So we're already starting. We're going to need to find a way with this data collection to make the case. And, so that'll be obviously our next step.
We have resubmitted the federal earmark to Senator Kane and Warner's offices. They are not optimistic at this point because of all the freezing that's going on in Washington, but we did resubmit it. We also have submitted a $100,000 grant request to the National Endowment for the Arts. And we should be hearing on that. I think we hear on that in May. So there is some requests out there, and there's some other smaller ones out there. But like Cindy says, we may have to do some research to see if there's something particular to this kind of to social isolation that we might be able to tap into.
So that regarding the steering committee, this would be the last meeting of the steering committee. Anything that we do from now on, we'll send you little updates. We wanted to really thank you for what you've witnessed and the comments you've made and your thoughts. And then we want to ask you, if you're willing, to share your thoughts with us, because all of this helps us to get to where we're going to go. The goal is to launch Ella and then eventually have training that is available that will help people other than Art for the Journey impact many more lives. And so you've heard to date where we are, and it's taken us about a year to get this far, a little bit more than a year. And we're trying to do it well. We're trying to be good stewards of this good work. And so anything you can send us in feedback, we would be very grateful for. But otherwise, we're signing off. We're saying thank you so much for all of you to have given your time today and for the time you've given in the past. And Megan, we'll get to see you pretty soon. And Mark, I love that idea of Short Pump, this massive art event.
Yes. And maybe people will pay for it. Who knows?
Yes.
Start collecting fees. But I just want to commend you guys, the students who put this together. Really, 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 really good. Thank you.
Well done, Claudia. She'll be wearing the fancy cap soon. Okay, bye everyone. Have a wonderful day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.